Hello everyone, welcome to this episode of Digging into Ceramics. Today I examine a remarkable example of American stoneware, made in Baltimore in the early 19th century. My story begins almost 15 years ago when grainy black and white photographs of this object surfaced in a weekly antique auction newspaper. I was excited by the incised decoration, showing a colonial-looking man shooting at a flying bird with some sort of pistol. I initially thought the decoration referenced duck and geese hunting in the Chesapeake Bay area, when generations of inhabitants relied upon these birds for their livelihood and survival. I considered that the image may be nothing more than the decorator's playful imagination, yet scenes of hunting and the use of firearms are extraordinarily rare in American stoneware, and that rarity alone compelled me to bid by phone on auction day. Though competitive, I finished second. The jug slipped away, and I set its memory aside as I moved on to the next pursuit. Several years later, an opportunity came my way, and I was able to acquire the object. When I saw it in person, I felt sure it had been made in Baltimore before 1820 or so. The Baltimore stoneware industry in the early 19th century was producing durable salt-glazed vessels for markets throughout the Mid-Atlantic and beyond. Its potters created beautifully decorated wares that documented events, identities, and regional pride, making Baltimore stoneware a vital link between craft, commerce, and American history. I identified the maker as Henry Remy Sr., who was trained in the New York State stoneware tradition, and his Baltimore career spans the War of 1812 through the 1820s. His decorations were both bold and fluid, and are among the most artistically significant of all American stonewares. After some study, it became evident that the man firing the pistol was dressed in the uniform of an early 19th century American militia officer. This full-length portrait of American General Jacob Brown exhibits the same ruffled shirt, tailcoat, pantaloons, and distinctive military hat. Knowing that it was a military uniform, I was able to make a connection to the events surrounding the Battle of Baltimore in 1814. Yet the full meaning of the scene still puzzled me. Was it a political metaphor or a romanticized depiction of an actual historical event? Ceramics have long recorded accounts of courageous deeds. Among the earliest examples are ancient Greek vases depicting scenes from the Trojan War. More than decoration, these images reinforce cultural memory and preserve shared narratives for future generations. Two historical figures stand at the center of Baltimore's most significant military engagements during America's War of 1812. General Robert Ross led the British offensive against his American counterpart, General John Stricker, commander of the Maryland militia. The two men met at the Battle of North Point, during which General Ross was mortally wounded by American riflemen. His death, as we shall see, had a great effect on the course of American events. To fully understand the significance of this story, a little history lesson is in order. The War of 1812 was not an isolated American conflict, but part of the broader global struggle between England and Napoleonic France. Sometimes called the Second War of American Independence, it grew out of British interference with American trade and the United States' desire to expand westward. The military actions lasted from 1812 to 1815 and involved battles on land and sea. Perhaps best known are the notable victories by the young United States Navy against the much larger and more powerful British fleet. On land, most of the military engagements took place along the Canadian border. In the Chesapeake, British forces used naval mobility to strike coastal towns, destroy supplies, and disrupt commerce. In 1813, American forces burned the Parliament buildings of York, Canada, the capital of the British Canadian colony. The British took their revenge in August 1814 when General Ross arrived in Washington, D.C. with his troops to set fire to many of its government buildings, including the Capitol and the White House. The burning of the White House shocked the American public, but it also provoked a surge of patriotism and determination to resist further British attacks. Following their success in Washington, D.C., General Ross marched his troops towards the important port city of Baltimore. The harbor there served as a base for American privateers who were actively disrupting British shipping, and of course, the location of Fort McHenry. The overall defense of Baltimore was led by Major General Samuel Smith, who has spent weeks organizing roughly 13,000 regular troops and militia. General Smith enforced a rigorous training schedule to ensure his militia were well prepared to meet the British regulars. On September 12th, General Ross and his troops landed at North Point, where he was met by the American forces led by General Stricker. This panoramic scene of the battle emphasizes the scale of the confrontation, showing both armies stretching across the expanse of woods and fields. The British had the superior numbers, sending out about 5,000 troops against 3,200 American militia. Despite being outnumbered, the Americans gave a good fight, but were losing the field. This engraving shows the position of the American riflemen in green, and in red, the moment when General Ross was shot. And although accounts differ, the shot seems to have come from quite a distance. Tradition holds that Daniel Wells and Henry McComas were the young Baltimore volunteers who fatally wounded General Robert Ross. Unfortunately, both young men lost their lives in the ensuing battle that day. Here we see the detail of two American sharpshooters preparing to fire from the cover of bushes. Now for this chap on horseback with the plaid bonnet on. There's a rifle pill for you. The successful shot strikes General Ross as he graphically exclaims, "Devil, take that Republican rascal with his rifle gun, for he's blown my brains out." The death of General Ross was a profound psychological blow to the British. The once invincible commander, who had set fire to America's most sacred buildings in Washington just a few weeks before, now lay dead, brought down by common American militiamen. Most importantly, his death delayed the full assault on Baltimore Harbor, allowing the Americans the much-needed time to fortify their positions. And the rest, as they say, is history. For 25 hours, Fort McHenry held fast against the rocket's red glare. At dawn, the American flag still flew, and Francis Scott Key had his answer. At this point, it was clear to me that the imagery was a salute to American marksmanship, and the shot that struck down General Ross. This event was beginning to look like one of the most pivotal moments in American military history. The decorator seems to have cast General Stricker himself as the agent of the fatal shot, using a pistol, not a rifle, magnifying the legend of American marksmanship and leadership. That could have been the end of the story, yet the image of the flying waterfowl still demanded explanation. I turned to the histories of the War of 1812, and though they praised the sharp aim of Maryland's militiamen, none could unlock the mystery of the ill-fated duck. I also looked into newspaper accounts of the battle, without much luck. But I did find some fascinating stories revolving around this important event. Following the death of General Ross, British Navy Captain William Stanhope Lovell took charge of the poor general's mortal remains. Lovell proceeds to prepare the body for transport to Halifax, Canada, the Royal Navy's principal base in North America. But the journey to Halifax was lengthy, and the general had to be stored in a cask of rum, an expedient commonly used to preserve bodies during extended sea voyages. In Halifax, Ross received a full military funeral and was buried with considerable fanfare at St. Paul's Church. We know from the detailed records kept by the British Navy, 129 gallons of rum were required to preserve the body of Robert Ross. As an aside, after his death in 1805, Admiral Nelson was likewise placed in a cask of brandy for the voyage back to England above the HMS Victory. The episode became one of the most famous examples of shipboard preservation in naval history. In the course of my research, I shared with a friend the fun fact of how General Ross was preserved in a cask, and he reacted by saying, "What a waste of perfectly good rum." I immediately had to correct him, though, because the story goes that the sailors who had transported his body had consumed the rum during the funeral march. Whether true or not, it leaves you with quite an indelible impression. This British satirical print, published soon after the death of Admiral Nelson, plays on the widely circulated story that his sailors also tapped his cask to toast him with the brandy. To this day, there is no agreement as to how much of this story is true. As I worked through the various accounts of the Battle of Baltimore, I came across a book titled Personal Narratives of Events from 1799 to 1815 by William Stanhope Lovell. Yes, this is the same Captain Lovell who placed General Ross in the cask of rum. Although the book was not published until the late 19th century, it recounts Lovell's experiences in the Royal Navy, including the significant naval actions at Baltimore. While waiting to set sail from Baltimore Harbor, Lovell described a prisoner of war swap between the Americans and British that took place above the British ship Royal Oak. Present at this meeting were Colonel Arthur Brooke, who had assumed command of the British land forces after Ross was mortally wounded, and Captain Edward Dix of the British frigate Menelaus. It was at this moment words leaped off the page as I read about an exchange between an American soldier and Captain Dix. Boasting of their good marksmen, Jonathan thought to be very witty by telling Captain Dix, who was fat and broad-made, "I guess, Captain, you cover a deal of ground. You had better not come on shore, for our riflemen can shoot a duck through the head with a single ball at 200 yards. Therefore, you will stand no chance." And so here was the connection that I had been seeking, linking the marksmanship of the American riflemen to the feat of hitting a duck through the head. And dare I say it, it was my smoking gun to solve the mystery of the image on the Baltimore picture. There was more to be gleaned from Lovell's account as well. Who was this American Jonathan who had made the boast to Captain Dix? I remember that the name Jonathan, or Brother Jonathan, was a satirical personification of the United States. As a forerunner to Uncle Sam, its English counterpart was John Bull. Brother Jonathan and John Bull were generally portrayed as adversaries, especially in political cartoons and popular prints during the War of 1812. One such example is this print, which shows Brother Jonathan forcefully administering a cordial to a British commander. By calling him Jonathan, it turns one man into a nation, his boast of marksmanship reflecting a broader American confidence. So I believe we have identified Brother Jonathan's duck and the shot that marked the moment the Battle of Baltimore turned. Clearly, everyday Baltimoreans would recognize that the duck was the stand-in for the dead British general. It is interesting to further note that the terms dead duck and lame duck would enter into American political parlance within a couple of decades from this event. The defeat at Baltimore forced British troops from the region, and within 3 months, the Treaty of Ghent was signed in December of 1814. Because of slow 19th century communications, the war's final battle, the Battle of New Orleans, occurred on January 8, 1815, weeks after the treaty had been signed. Baltimoreans almost immediately began to celebrate their victory, establishing an annual holiday known as Defenders' Day in 1815. And with a little photo magic, one might imagine the picture being brought out for this celebration. Today, the celebrations continue, and on each September 12th, the city rises to the occasion with parades, fireworks, and memorials. In 1816, the artist Rembrandt Peale was commissioned to portray Baltimore's defenders. Among them stood Major General Olmsted of Fort McHenry, who had ordered the great flag that had flown above the ramparts. In 2018, this Baltimore-made jar came to auction from the pottery shop of David Parr and James Berlin. The jar was made at the same time the defenders' portraits were painted, and I suggest that it captures the likeness of the Major, making it the second example of local stoneware to reference the Battle of Baltimore. Baltimore's Battle Monument was built between 1815 and 1829. It is the nation's first significant war memorial recognizing the citizens who died defending the city from the British attack. And perhaps not surprisingly, the Battle Monument was commemorated on a Baltimore stoneware jar around the time of its completion. Another Baltimore monument was erected to honor the suspected shooters of General Ross in 1817. Just 3 years after the Battle of North Point. The bodies of Daniel Wells and Henry McComas are buried beneath the monument. The Baltimore picture serves as a powerful bridge between material culture and everyday memory. And not unlike the ancient Greek vases, it preserves a story that might otherwise have been lost to time. Whether scratched into wet clay or set down upon the page, our need to record, remember, and pass on history is deeply rooted in human culture. What first appeared as a whimsical depiction can now be recognized as one of our great national artifacts, directly connected to a singular event that helped bring the War of 1812 to its close. It represents one of my most exciting journeys in the study of American ceramic history. For further reading, please see my article published in the 2025 volume of Ceramics in America.